Welcome to today's Venable Nonprofit Organizations Group monthly webinar. This one is titled Catalyzing Change, Alternatives to Traditional Grantmaking. I'm George Constantine. I co-chair the Venable Nonprofit Organizations Practice Group along with Janice Ryan. And I'm happy to be here to introduce our speakers in today's webinar and get things kicked off. First, I'll just note today's webinar is going to be the last one for the nonprofit group for 2025. We're in deep now planning for 2026 topics, and certainly welcome any input you may have for topics in the coming year. Part of the follow-up you get after this webinar concludes, we'll ask for any inputs, ideas, thoughts on new topics for us to consider. And I encourage you to give us any of those ideas, and it really helps to have that input as we plan topics for the year. So on to this topic, as many of you know, many nonprofits are continuing to look for ways to make a real impact in pursuit of their missions. And many are turning maybe towards less traditional approaches to grant making and project funding. And so I'm really excited that we have a great pair of panelists here to address the issue, both from the legal side with Yossi and more from the implementation side with Callie. So hopefully we will be able to leave you with some great ideas for innovative approaches in the future on this topic. Briefly, I'll introduce our panelists and then turn it over to Yossi to get started. Yossi Ziffer is a partner in Venable's Baltimore office. He works with tax-exempt organizations on a number of issues, including tax, governance, corporate, fundraising, and many other matters that come about in the day-to-day practice working with tax-exempt organizations. Yossi has been an integral part of our team for 20 plus years now, and many of you probably know him or at least recognize his name from the work he's done over the years for many of you. Speaking with Yossi today is Callie Riley. She's Managing Director of Cambiar Education, and Callie is coming to us from Washington, D.C. Yossi will give a more comprehensive review of Callie's very impressive background as part of his presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Yossi and say goodbye and again, encourage you to think of new topics if you've got them, to submit them to us. So over to you, Yossi.
Thanks, George, and nice to be with everyone today. Thank you for joining. Really excited to be here to discuss this topic, and even more excited to be joined by Callie. Callie Riley serves as a managing director at Cambiar Education, which is a nonprofit education venture studio. And there she sits on the senior leadership team and leads the organization's efforts to support the impact, scale, and sustainability of nonprofit curriculum developers. Before joining Cambiar, Callie served as a senior program officer, the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Philanthropies National Education Team, as a consultant to school districts, states, and foundations, and in multiple management roles at other national education policy nonprofits. She began her career as a middle school English and reading teacher in Japan and Florida. Callie holds a master's in educational leadership and policy from University of Maryland, College Park, and a bachelor's from Wittenberg University. Outside of work, she serves as a board member for a large DC-based nonprofit and a charter school trustee, as well as an advisor for several other nonprofit and for-profit education companies. And again, I'm really just so excited that Callie is able to join us today, because she and her colleagues at Cambiar really are at the forefront as thought leaders when it comes to different ways of deploying philanthropic capital to make an impact. I know you're going to really enjoy hearing what Callie has to share with you today. So just to get us started, here's what we're going to set out to do over the next little bit. Going to turn it over to Callie to introduce Cambiar, identify issues in traditional grant making, what it's good for, and where sometimes it falls short or its limitations. Define some terms that may or may not be familiar to all of you. Talk about the strategic side when we use different forms of philanthropic support. And then I'll come back and join after Callie's presentation to discuss many of the legal considerations that go into these choices and options. So with that, very pleased to hand it over to Callie.
Thanks, Yossi. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you today and just really thankful to the Venable team for having me join. This is actually my second big presentation of this work publicly. And so bear with me as we're kind of working through some of our communication around it, but exciting to be on the line with so many probably nonprofit leaders, legal experts as part of your learning journey. And just want to say again, a deep thank you to Yossi, who's been such an incredible partner in this work as we've stood it up. Next slide. So before we jump in, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Cambiar, a little bit about myself. What is the problem that we've been trying to solve at kind of a meta level, as well as why we're focusing where we are right now. So Cambiar as an organization has been around for about a decade. We were the first K-12 nonprofit venture studio in the country. And our foundation, our leader and CEO, Christina Heights, noticed very early on through a lot of her other work in both the nonprofit and for-profit sector that oftentimes the best ideas were not getting the greatest scale. So what could we do to actually ensure that those best ideas that they're most radical and innovative can get out there and serve as many students as possible? In the past decade, Cambiar has propelled over 100 game-changing ventures that operate at the speed of innovation. And our team does that through a couple different ways. One is we support incredible entrepreneurs to develop and scale their ideas, really from seed to scale. So that's startup stage through growth stage. We also directly run programs that focus on a range of issues, including innovative systems leader development, student career exploration and workforce development, student-led entrepreneurship, providing data back to caregivers and students to enable them to make better decisions about their academic experiences, as well as my portfolio. Next slide, please. So on your screen, you see a little bit of the reason why I came to Cambiar. So I'll give you a background of my why. Yossi provided a little bit of a high-level background about where I came from. But I spent the past several years working in the space of both policy and practice in education, now for almost 2 decades, starting in the classroom as a teacher. And what we've often seen, especially around key areas around teaching and learning, around standards assessments and accountability, has just been a lot of challenges, especially with nonprofits that are supporting those efforts. One area that I've keyed in on for the past several years has actually been thinking about how to ensure that the curriculum, when many of you are probably familiar with from your own days or your own school-age children, that's being used by teachers and students in the classroom is of high quality, responsive to student needs, and adapting with the marketplace's environment change. Curriculum, I don't know if you know this, is a multi-billion-dollar business, and many of the organizations that I've supported over the years have been nonprofits, and we've supported them from being small startups to growth stage organizations, and have been real disruptors in this space. So really trying to compete with these very large for-profit companies for significant parts of the market share. We've noticed over the years, though, that there's been a real issue, especially as those organizations have grown, to be able to get over the hump in order to get towards sustainability. Oftentimes, nonprofits in general get stuck in this messy middle space where they have to make a lot of decisions about what direction do they go. Do they actually transition to being a for-profit, a PBC? Do they look at merging with another nonprofit? And so what we realized is that we wanted to think differently about what kind of funding we could provide that help organizations really be in a position of strength as they're making those decisions going forward. Next slide. So we asked ourselves a few questions as we were going down this journey. What if we were able to remove barriers for nonprofits so they could innovate and scale their high impact solutions? What if we equipped those nonprofits with the financial options and expertise refined in the for-profit sector to level the playing field and scale impact, and ultimately changing the education marketplace for good? Next slide. So this has led us to thinking a little bit differently about how we deploy capital in order to finance organizations, specifically nonprofits in the curriculum space to start. We wanted to look at patient long-term growth capital that nonprofits don't typically have access to in order to enable them to compete at scale. We also wanted to be a committed partner dedicated to those impact, scale, and sustainability goals of the organizations that we're supporting through capacity building, research and evaluation investments, and advising. In my portfolio alone, to give you an idea, we think about ourselves as an impact first portfolio, and I'll talk about our impact first fund. And our big, hairy, audacious goal, as we like to say, is that through the portfolio of organizations we invest in, we want to enable at least 20 million students. And to put that into context, there's about over 50 million public or K-12 students across public, private, and independent schools across the country and charters, to experience high quality curricular materials, leading to an increased positive student outcomes, particularly for those at the margins. So for those students that have been traditionally underserved.
Callie,
Next.
how
Oh,
come
sure.
nonprofits don't have access to this capital? Meaning before Cambiar, how come they weren't able to access the same funding that
Sure. So you see, I think one of the perennial problems that we've seen is that we call it the messy middle of funding, is that oftentimes earlier stage nonprofits have had access to, say, project-based funding, and I'll get a little bit into more of these details in just a second, but they've had access to things like project-based funding, which really limit your ability to spend, right, outside of those specific ideas or initiatives. Sometimes they have access to general operating funding, but we know that that's actually highly dependent on the foundation that you're potentially working with. Then there's this gray space or this space that's quite untapped. And then at the other end, what we've often seen is traditional debt. And that has often required a nonprofit organization to have a strong existing relationship with a lender, or having other avenues to get to them in order to secure that kind of debt. And most are not in the position to do so, especially when they're at the stage of particular growth. But it's a great question. And actually, Yossi, if you click to the next slide, I can talk about some of the other challenges that we've seen. So we generally said the problems that nonprofits have around financing fall into about four buckets. And we've also looked at this through the lens of curriculum too, because there's really long cycles around adoption and purchasing that have informed the way that we think about patients too in this space. So the first one that we've seen is that growth capital. Typically, nonprofits don't have access to growth capital or equity-like investments to support scaling. So typical growth capital has meaningful potential returns to offset risk. Long-term patient capital hasn't readily been available to fund investments needed to successfully scale in the curriculum space because early-stage equity investors typically take the long-term view needed for success, and that's something we are excited about. The second thing that we've often seen is around access to debt. The existing standard market debt instruments beyond working capital lines are not necessarily an optimal fit for nonprofits in the curriculum space, or I would say a lot of nonprofits who are doing operating products and services. They have a limited ability to generate returns over capital over a short-term period. So again, we want to take a long-term view, and standard payback periods are too short. Market interest rates are too high. We're obviously seeing a lot of fluctuations in the market right now. And we know that that creates a lot of concerns for the nonprofits that we have tended to support. Also, innovation. I mentioned before at Cambiar, we are very interested in supporting innovative organizations. We want the ability to drive impact through innovation, and timely reinvestment is often muted and limits the organization's ability to compete with for-profit counterparts. This is very key, and I mentioned earlier that often work with nonprofit disruptors that are competing against for-profits that are taking up a large share of the marketplace. So how are we able to think strategically about resource allocations that are made without the benefit of long-term planning? And we also know that creating and scaling curriculum often requires a long investment cycle infrastructure. And then finally, philanthropy. I come from traditional philanthropy. Philanthropy is wonderful. I think we're really excited about doing things differently, though. And a lot of my peers and I have been thinking about this over the past several years about what we can do. Philanthropy, as we just talked about, is historically funded projects versus business plans. It's a very important distinction. Again, something that is a moment in time over the course of a couple of years, a very specific initiative, versus thinking about what does the organization want to be and be able to do, and where do they want to have impact in the next 5 or 10 years. And that also means that funding for projects should include innovative product development. That's always critical, but it doesn't also cover the costs that are associated with scaling. So things like building infrastructure, like sales, marketing, partnerships, these are often the things that get short shrift as part of those typical grant making processes, but they also require significant capital, especially in the startup phase, to operationalize and succeed. So next slide, Josie. So on your screen is going to show you where we've landed with the fund that we have started with. So I want to note here that our fund is not all encompassing. I get asked that a lot because you have to start somewhere, especially when you're building a new model. So our fund is specifically starting with nonprofit curriculum developers, of which have a decent share of the marketplace and helping them scale, again, to reach those 20 million kids. Right now, we have roughly about $27.5 million that they were able to use for direct investments through our blended financing strategy, with the goal to raise several million more over the next couple of years to continue to look at other cycles of investments. We have a few different types of investments, which I'm going to go deeper onto. And right now, through 2026, we will end up making about 6 investments in total across the full range of these vehicles. Our current focus is on the screen, nonprofit curriculum developers, often deemed high quality, which is a specific term that we use in the K-12 education space, that are research-based or have a path to that, or that we think have the real impact or ability to impact the field. And that are also already on a path to sustainability. So we're not typically looking at earlier stage startup organizations. I'll talk a little bit about how we think about the matching of our vehicles and the stage of the organization, but those that are again in that growth stage opportunity. And then we also provide additional support. So we think about our fund as a set of holistic investments where we're not just looking at the money out the door, we're also thinking about technical assistance, capacity building, and investments in our research and evaluation. Next slide. And next slide. So as I mentioned, we're trying to address the messy middle between grants and traditional debt of nonprofit financing, especially for products and services focused organizations in those critical growth stages. I think it's important to note when I talk about this, again, that we've really thought about this idea of what does it mean to be patient and flexible and stackable in terms of our capital, in large part because things like curriculum purchasing, at least where we're starting, is typically driven by state marketplaces and multi-year adoption cycles. Thus, that pushes us to think even more critically about what a multi-year investment actually looks like and what we can expect in terms of return and as part of a partnership. If you enter into these long-term partnerships with organizations, what else can we provide them to be successful? I also want to note that deploying these types of stackable investments that I'm going to talk about require a much more extensive diligence process, which I'll also get to what we look for on that, especially on the finance side, and frequent ongoing progress monitoring to know how the organizations are progressing towards their long-term goals. This is something that we see bits and pieces of in traditional philanthropy, but oftentimes not something that is typically sitting on a programs team, but maybe on the investment side of the house. Next slide. So on this slide, you're going to see our financial North Star. We spent a long time thinking about what it is that we actually want as part of an impact first fund. When we think about for-profit funds, we're looking for typically, right, and there are different types of for-profit investors, but often looking for quicker returns, higher returns at the end of the day, so that organizations are able to exit, they're able to bring new folks into their portfolio. We're thinking a little bit differently in terms of we want a fund where the goal is to provide benefits on both sides. If we're looking at long-term investments, we want both the investor, us, and the investee to be successful at the end of the day. And we also want the ability, as money returns into the fund, to have the opportunity to redeploy that into the field. We think our model is a really good solution because we're not optimizing for typical debt or equity returns, we're optimizing for impact. Really excited about that particular work, and always think in the back of our head that the organizations that we're supporting are likely led by brilliant academic leaders, and we're asking them to be brilliant business leaders at the same time. So what can the combination of our different investment instruments allow them to do both in the short and long-term run? And finally, we're really willing to share in the risk with our investment organizations. And I think you'll see that show up in our model too, in terms of the terms that we're setting, of which Venable has been really an incredible partner at helping us to do so. So if these organizations exceed our expectations, so will the fund, and that's our ultimate goal. Next slide. So we tried to combine the best of what we saw in the field in terms of investment options. I always like to say that what we're doing is more innovative because of how we're putting it together and how we're deploying the funds. But all of these different instruments that I'm going to mention exist in the space right now, but oftentimes they're existing in isolation. For many of the nonprofit leaders on this call, I'd like to say one thing is really helpful is to get familiar with these so you can advocate for these instruments, whether or not it's with the foundation as some sort of lending partner, that there's the opportunity to be creative, right, with the solutions that enable you to do your best work at the end of the day. We've found that this work isn't often being done because it's really hard work. And from what we found when developing the fund, there weren't any clear models in the education nonprofit space that combined the various instruments that we were hoping, along with success-based features to utilize. So we built our own, keying off learnings and insights from other smart people in both the nonprofit and for-profit financing space, and identifying our ways our funding could help mitigate challenges for growth stage nonprofit leaders that they typically face. Next slide.
Callie, before we
yeah.
go on to the next slide, what has Cambiar's experience been in terms of the response from your potential grant partners, grant or investment recipients? Are these ideas that is Cambiar doing a lot of education to its partners around why you're using these types of tools, or are these things that are already familiar to them? Is it a hard sell, or people say, "Can I just have a grant?" How has that gone for you?
Everybody wants just a grant at the end of the day, right? Yossi? And so the answer is a little bit of it's taking a lot of education, right, for our potential partners. When folks found out, and I didn't mention that for several years before this fund was stood up, I was working with a partner in another large philanthropy to think through what could we do in this space that would be new, interesting, and innovative? So we actually engaged a lot of nonprofit leaders before we even got to the jump of launching this fund, and said, what has been working for you in the past? What hasn't worked for you in terms of funding? If you could wave your magic wand, what types of vehicles might you like to see? And got a lot of different responses at the end of the day. And I think what we've learned is that it's not a hard sell once people understand the reasoning behind the different vehicles. And it's not a hard sell, especially when they think about the limitations of traditional grant making right now, and the fact that many philanthropies are actually not growing their portfolio size of investments. They're actually what we call right sizing right now. There was a large expansion that happened in the COVID era, and many philanthropic organizations kind of ballooned their annual gift or annual giving, and that's retracted in the past couple of years. And so I think that what we've heard from our nonprofit partners is we're open to creativity here, especially if it means, though, that there's an opportunity for a long-term partnership. It means that you're not just going to ask us for things that are going to happen in 1 or 2 years, but you really are going to sit alongside us for the next several years. And so I would say we are learning every day about what that messaging needs to look like, and what's critical is being out there talking about it with, in forums like this one with you, and getting feedback on what they understand, where they still have questions. All right, so this is the big slide, as I like to say it. So this is our model that we came up with. And I mentioned it took a long time to get here. We had some ideas. We talked to a lot of folks, including in for-profit funds of, if you could go back in time and you could do things differently and think differently about vehicles, what would those look like? So what we did was we landed on a 4-vehicle model that you see on your screen that we're really excited about. So I'm going to start on a couple different sides around the different types of investments and our whys behind it. So on your left-hand side, you're going to see the operating grants, and those are traditional grants. I want to note that all of our instruments are flexible funding. That's really key because most of the time, as I mentioned before, we typically think about project-based funding where you may have deliverables or milestones that are tied to every quarter, every 6 months, 1 year. We take a very long-term view and want organizations to have the flexibility to make decisions in real time about where resources will best be allocated. So we have an operating grant. We have a commitment to operating grants as part of every single one of our investment stacks. And that the reason being is that with operating grant, we want those to be used as more flexible catalytic dollars to build capacity for newer but essential business operations and exploratory efforts, such as marketing, sales, early R&D for new products. We think that is key to success. We always want it to be there. Again, operating grants are familiar. What's a little bit less familiar about this, though, is that they really are truly flexible in this case, and we're looking at longer term strategies. On your right-hand side, you're going to see term loans. Term loans, again, not unusual, but what's a little bit unusual is the structure of the term loans that we have. These are long-term, low interest rates. And so we will never be more than half of market rate. Right now, we've pegged it at 3%. And it also includes a revenue share, one of the success-based features as an incentive for the fund. And the reason why we've included that revenue share in there is because what we've said is if someone is getting a term loan, if we've assessed the debt capacity, we think that you're able to have a term loan, is that we're saying that for 5 years, it's only interest-only repayment. And it's very low. And principal repayment doesn't happen until after years 6 through 8. And so we will have been in the trenches with organizations as they're building their products, they're building their services, they're going to market. We'll have a good sense too about how those are performing. And so we see as an incentive back to the fund is being able to layer in that revenue sharing for those out years alongside the principal repayment. So there's additional upside for the fund. In the middle two, and these are structures that we've been working very closely with Venable on for the past several months, are the two that we think are a little bit more on the innovative side. And so the first one I will note is the recoverable loan. And so when we look at the assessment of debt capacity for organizations, sometimes we say, gosh, they want a term loan, but we just don't think they're there. A recoverable loan actually allows us to fill in that need with both recourse and revenue share. So we have the options there as we set milestones. These are very long term. If the metrics are achieved, there's 0% interest with principal repayment in the out years. If the metrics aren't achieved, we actually see that that's when we have both the principal repayment restructured to higher revenue share post years 5 through 10. So what you'll see is this use of rev share too, used in slightly different ways depending on the vehicle. So I do want to point that out. It's something that Yossi and I talked a little bit about. We never want any kind of recourse to feel punitive in nature. We are in this for a long term, which means that hopefully at some point, if we see things are not going the way that they need to for milestones, we have the opportunity to work with that organization, their leader, to course correct. With these two longer term vehicles, we're really hoping that's supporting longer term plans and strategic initiatives that are essential to impact scale and sustainability. The convertible grants is another option that I'm really excited about too. And those are used primarily to drive shorter term revenue or profit growth. So new product development, new strategies essential to high growth opportunities, core operational shifts in business models with near term metrics to drive innovation, on time delivery, and budget efficiencies. And the convertible grant is exciting to me because we realized that we were often focusing so far on the long term with all of these vehicles, but there was nothing there originally in our model. We had 2 instruments, then we had 3, and then we said there we need a fourth. And that fourth needs to be something that incentivizes some of those shifts that need to happen in the short term that lead to long-term outcomes. So for example, an organization needs to get a new product in a particular selling cycle in a particular timeline. We can actually tie a metric to that to say, great, if you want to get this new product out in the next year and a half, if you do that, if you hit that milestone, here's your incentive around the convertible grant. Again, we engage in this intensive strategy, operational, and financial diligence with our organizations that meet our pipeline criteria to assess these long-term plans and make sure that our matching process works well. Yossi, I'm happy to see if you have any other questions, especially with the model on the screen, before I go to the next slide.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll get to this in a little bit, but trying to figure out when each tool best applies, right? I mean, meaning to some extent, all of these, certainly the middle two vehicles, they sort of feel similar, and you have to think, think critically about how they differentiate from each other and when one fits and when the other fits. But I think we'll come to that. But you just made reference to the idea of doing diligence on your grantees, and maybe we'll come to this as well. But if you want to speak a little bit about what it is that you're looking for, how do you know when a potential nonprofit is a good candidate for this?
Sure. So we have fairly strict, as I mentioned right now, fairly strict gating criteria. And so all of the organizations we're investing in right now already have met a certain quality or around bar around high quality materials. They also have a certain amount of student reach, so at least 100,000 students, but many of them are above and beyond that. They have a strong commitment to efficacy and impact research. And so there's several different kind of lists or several different gating criteria that we adhere to before an organization can even be in consideration. They also have to be a nonprofit. That narrows the list pretty considerably. We also want to see a commitment to being a true partner with us. And I know that sounds a little squishy, but it's actually a hard thing to do. That means an organizational leader, instead of in traditionally meeting, say, with your program officer at a philanthropic organization quarterly or once a year, they're meeting with me monthly about strategy. They're meeting with me every quarter to talk about their finances. We're talking extensively about where they're tracking towards their milestones. What are the strategic shifts that they might want to make along our multi-year investment period. And so that's something that we're assessing for too, is that strength of leader and strength of leadership team to say, do they want to be true partners with us? If that's not something that's in the cards or they're not able to make that commitment, it's not going to be the right fit for this fund. And it might be helpful for them to pursue other pathways. But I would say there's a lot of that other piece that we're looking for. And Yossi, I'll get into a couple of the other diligence pieces that we also review that might be helpful for folks of like what we're really looking for at the end of the day.
Great.
So next slide. There we go. So I think it's helpful when you think about the fact that we have these four stackable, patient flexible instruments. How might these apply to my organization? And so this is art and science at the end of the day. And one thing that we tried to do, and we have several different grids that look different ways, is we tried to think too about what were the different investment strategies that we see in the for-profit sector. So we can actually match this up fairly closely to how you look at seed through Series A, B, C as well. And so we think about these organizations at various stages. So we think about them all the way from startup, which is not typically where we invest, although we might do a grant-based investment here or there. It would only be an operating grant, all the way through mature and renewal. That means that those organizations have a track record, they have a strong revenue base, they've faced market headwinds and they've been winning. They have really strong earned revenue, and we know that we need to help get them to a certain place. And we match that up with our investment purpose, how we think about the return profile, and also the investment options. And so you'll see on the right side of your screen, those investment options give you a general sense about how we think about the stacking of these different vehicles when we go in for that initial investment. Like any sort of investment process or diligence process, we go through gating, we do a lot of pre-diligence, then we do a lot of calls too, to talk to an organization about their vision, their current financial status, and where they want to be in the next several years. And then we put together a hypothesis, right, that we want to test through the rest of diligence around where it is that we actually think we're going to land with our recommendations around these investment vehicles. So we may hypothesize that an organization needs $10 million of capital, and we think it's going to be broken out in a particular way across those vehicles. Through our diligence, though, we always, we have the opportunity to do some correction on that and to step back and think, well, we may have thought that they were going to be, we may have thought that $3 million of that was going to be a term loan. What we really see is maybe $2 million of that, because of their current debt capacity, is where we need to land. And 1 million of that now needs to be codified in a recoverable loan in order to make up that difference. So there is a lot of negotiation that happens as part of diligence, but I think it's really helpful to think about how we think about the different stages of maturity.
And on that point, is it a give and take where the grantee, the target, may say, we think that we would like product X or product Y, or is it more of them saying, here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's what we're about, and Cambiar says, this is what we can offer you?
It's largely the latter, Yossi. It's a great question. I mentioned that we do a lot of pre-diligence with the organization. It's been a big learning for us. And so that's getting them familiar with the model and what the different instruments mean and can mean to them, so that when we're going into those conversations, there's a clear understanding of why we make recommendations in a certain way. But we're very clear up front too that it's highly unlikely that everything is going to be a full grant package or a full grant plus convertible grant package, and that we really want to exercise as many of the different instruments and stack them as possible, especially because that just gives us a more diverse set of milestones too that we can attach to it as we're looking at these long-term investments. So next slide. So I'm going to go through these actually pretty quickly. And so you'll see if you want to go to the next one and then maybe the next one. All right. So I wanted to just pull up really quickly and show kind of our process here. I mentioned that we are very, very strong in capacity building. It's a key part of our diligence process, which means that we actually do a pretty deep assessment of where an organization is across a full spectrum of different kind of organizational capacity areas before we enter into a partnership. That sometimes allows us to do test investments before you even look at a longer term investment. And on the bottom of your screen, you're going to see the full spectrum of how we think about the investment process, all the way from deal sourcing and screening through diligence, which usually takes a few months, through negotiation and execution, along with our legal partner, Venable, through our portfolio measurement and optimization, which really goes into this ongoing progress monitoring that we do that's pretty intensive, as I mentioned, all the way through long-term investments in research and evaluation or efficacy and impact studies. Next slide.
Yeah, and just before we go to the next slide, I'm just
Sure.
going to jump in for 1 second. I know that some people on the webinar are going to be seeking CLE credit for their participation today.
Great.
And the code for the CLE qualification is grants, GRANTS 2025. That's grants 2025.
Great. So I just mentioned this capacity diagnostic. So if we want to go to the next slide, this gives you a sense of some of the priority areas that we see when we're looking at investments. And so we use this not only as we're thinking about our actual due diligence, which really expands upon many of these areas, but also how we think about how we lean in on technical assistance and capacity building and coaching. So this range all the way from how the organization is approaching governance and leadership to how they're thinking about their branding, marketing, sales, and strategic communication strategies, IT and technology. We look at it all. And so my joke has been that when I was in traditional philanthropy, my grantee partners thought I was a pretty intense program officer. But this is definitely a more intense process that we're entering into because we want to deeply, deeply understand the organizations that we're hoping to support. Next slide. And then this is a little bit about our diligence funnel. So this is very high level. There's a lot of other questions that come under here, a ton of documentation collection. But I want to highlight a couple of things that I think are particularly important is that we are always looking for commercial and mission alignment. That is utmost, that is paramount, that is where we start. And we also deeply care, as I mentioned, about the competence, the resilience, and the innovation of the senior leadership team and the CEO of the organization. Although we know that that can change over time. And along with our partners, we think about, like Venable, we think about how it is that we embed into our legal, mitigations against that, especially as an organization may change and evolve. And also, I mentioned, they're meeting with us a lot. So we want to make sure that they are in it with us and they are prepared to do so. Something that I think is particularly important that I think is often underattended to in nonprofits is this third bucket around finances. Nonprofits are often relying on traditional philanthropy for the bulk of their revenue at the end of the day. Some organizations are 100% reliant on philanthropy. That's not where we're trying to help organizations get to. We're actually trying to help them reduce reliance on philanthropy over time. So that means upwards of 80–90% of earned revenue to help them really sustain their core operations. And that requires having things like very, very high quality integrated financial models. And that may seem like oh, duh, of course we should have that. But you may be surprised, or maybe you work in organizations where that doesn't exist. You have a lot of different Excel spreadsheets that are a lot of different places. It's not particularly clear what the drivers are around your various revenue sources, what your inputs and outputs are. And so being able to pay special attention to that and put extra investments in your finance team really goes a long way, especially in our particular process. And finally, as part of our confirmatory due diligence process, we also look at legal, We also look at tech and product stacks when we're looking at various products that we're potentially investing in. Next slide. So I'm getting down to the very end. We think a lot, as I mentioned before, about integrated success of the portfolio, and that means that we are providing support around measurement, coaching, and collaboration. We bring together our portfolio organizations through a community of practice, several of them, several times a year, so they can share ideas. They support one another as CEOs and C-suite teams, and we help them with both long-term and short-term problem solving. We also provide direct TA and coaching support. And again, I mentioned that we're doing a lot of intensive ongoing performance monitoring and proactive remediation. That is key when we're thinking about long-term strategies. Next slide. And then the final piece of the puzzle. I think a lot of you, if you're nonprofit leaders, you know that one thing that is often not attended to as part of funding is the ability to actually assess the impact of your organization and maybe what you're doing out in the field. So a key part of the way that we think about our investments beyond the blended financing portion, beyond the technical assistance and capacity building, is that we're actually directly investing in studying the efficacy and impact of the organizations that we're supporting. So we have actually built our own framework for research and evaluation, and we fund through that framework, and all with the goal of helping organizations achieve a certain tier and level of evidence through a third-party evaluation. That work has just started for us, and we're super excited to continue on. And I think that goes to the last slide, Yossi, before I'm happy to hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Callie. And I think as is obvious to everyone who's been listening, one of the things that Cambiar is really doing is just being so thoughtful and intentional about what it does in a space that is still ripe for innovation. And that makes it very exciting for us on the legal side to work with Cambiar, and appreciate that opportunity to somewhat build the plane as you're flying it, right? And to really figure out what works, learn from experience, and watch the model develop. So in the time that we have remaining, just going to highlight some of the different legal issues that come up when we think about these hybrid models. And I think in terms of framing that discussion, a good way to think about it is the following: that similar to one of the slides that we saw from Callie, there's a spectrum. And if on one end of the spectrum, you have just outright charitable grants, and there the motivation for a nonprofit funder is clear. You're providing philanthropic support to a recipient. You've identified what it is that recipient is doing that's consistent with your mission as a funder, and you have deployable philanthropic dollars to provide funding to support that activity. And then way at the other end of the spectrum, you have your investments, because nonprofits need to responsibly and prudently manage their assets. And it would not be responsible and prudent to just keep all that money in a checking account, let's say. And so nonprofits need to responsibly invest to perpetuate the financial viability and growth of their organizations. And we all know what investing looks like. That is looking at what's going to provide the best return to the organization. And then you have this middle ground where your mission dollars and your investments start to come together. And that's where people sometimes call it impact investing or mission related investing. And those are some of the issues that I want to talk about in the time that we have remaining. Now, one of the things that you heard from Callie is that at this point in time, Cambiar is focusing its activities, its funding focus on other nonprofits. And to the extent, speaking from the funder side, if you're providing alternative grant making techniques to other charitable organizations, other 501c3 organizations, then really the primary legal considerations are going to be around the deal terms. What do I mean by that? It's that whether something is a grant or something is an investment or something in the middle, if you have dollars going from one 501c3 organization to another, then as far as the funder's tax exempt status goes, there really isn't a whole lot in the way of risk, because C3 to C3 support is fundamental to what charities do. And you really couldn't have something that calls into question the charitability of that activity, because the recipient of the dollars is subject to all of those same restrictions and limits that apply to the funder. 501c3 status says there can't be private enrollment, there can't be private benefit, you can't have owners of a nonprofit. And so to the extent that dollars are flowing back and forth between 501c3 organizations of one type or another, you don't really have a whole lot in the way of calling into question or raising any hard challenges for the charitable status of the funder. But certainly more significant issues arise once the recipient of that transfer is something other than a 501c3 charity, which could be a for-profit that the 501c3 funder has identified as worthy, suitable for support, or some other non-charitable nonprofit. There are many other types of nonprofit organizations that may not be 501c3. And when you're looking at it from the funder's perspective, a charity has to ensure that its dollars are used in furtherance of charitable purposes. So as long as that money is going to another charity, there's a built-in assurance that it will be used for charitable purposes. Once the dollars are going to something other than a charity, again, whether for-profit or just some other type of nonprofit, then more significant questions come into play for the funder to make sure that its dollars are being used in furtherance of charitable purposes. The way to think about this issue is informed largely by the program-related investment rules. And to be clear, these rules originate in the private foundation context. Private foundations are subject to a variety of rules based on their status as such, that they aren't publicly funded, and for various policy reasons, the tax code says because those organizations aren't publicly funded, they are subject to certain additional restrictions and limits on their activity. And one of those rules that applies to private foundations is that a private foundation cannot make what's called a jeopardy investment or a jeopardizing investment. Essentially, Congress decided that because private foundations receive all of their money from a single source, typically, we don't want them being overly aggressive, overly risky in terms of how they invest their dollars. And they don't have the same inherent public accountability as a public charity does that is inherently accountable to its donor base. And so what the Jeopardy investment rules say is that when it comes to a private foundation making an investment, it should err on the side of being conservative, not unduly risky. But there's an exception to that rule. And the exception says that if the investment, which may have a high risk quotient to it, is a program-related investment, that will not be treated as a jeopardy investment. And although these rules originate in the private foundation context, as a practical matter, the framework of a PRI is utilized by public charities as well. And the way to think about it is that if it's okay for a private foundation to do, it is almost by definition equally acceptable for a public charity to do it. Private foundations, as a rule of thumb, are subject to stricter rules than public charities. And so if something is deemed to be charitable for a private foundation as a PRI, it will likewise be considered charitable for a public charity. And the key elements for identifying a PRI are what you see here on the bottom half of the slide. First, that the primary purpose of the investment is to accomplish one or more charitable outcomes. Second, that there is no significant purpose of income production or asset appreciation. And then the third, which is a little bit of a giveaway, that no use of the investment is to influence legislation or intervene in political elections. Not going to focus on that last third because it's typically a given. But when it comes to PRIs, there's a lot of focus on those first two elements. So focusing on the first, how do you identify whether the primary purpose of an investment is to achieve one or more charitable outcomes? Well, what you look at is that the benefit of the investment advances one or more charitable purposes. And in doing so, you really have to think about, well, how do we measure impact? How do I identify what it is that this investment is truly seeking to accomplish? And I think you heard from Callie some very thought-provoking ways to think about how to measure impacts. But in the PRI context, one of the litmus tests for this first element, that the primary purpose of the investment is to achieve charitable outcomes, is a but-for test. That the organization would not have made this expenditure, would not have made this investment, but for the relationship between the investment and the charitable outcome that is sought to be achieved. And this really dovetails. The two tests are very subtle in their differentiation. This really dovetails with the second aspect of the PRI test, which is that there is no significant purpose of economic return. It doesn't mean that there can't be any purpose of economic return, and the presence and realization of economic return does not, in and of itself, call into question the legitimacy of the PRI. And if we're being honest, everyone wants the economic return. But for every home run that's out there, there are a whole bunch of swings and misses as well. And when thinking about qualifying something as a PRI, one of the things that you look at is, would a purely profit-motivated investor be likely to make this investment? The more that it competes with pure profit-motivated investments, the less likely that something is going to qualify as a PRI. And how do you measure whether something would be attractive to a profit-motivated investor? You have to look at the whole range of investment factors: the expected return, risk profile, repayment schedule, all the economic aspects of it. And what, again, Callie mentioned that in Cambiar's example, the debt instruments are specifically structured in a way where the interest component coming back is below market. Something like that, a below market loan, would be a good example of how to identify something as a PRI, where the charitability is taking the lead and the investment or the economic appreciation is taking a back seat to that. So those are PRIs, and if you have an investment that meets the various elements of that test, then in the private foundation context, not only is it not a Jeopardy investment, but the IRS says that it's actually going to be treated as the equivalent of a grant. It will count towards a private foundation's grant-making quota. But let's say you have something else out there that is its economic terms are a little bit too good, and you don't think that it's going to qualify as a PRI. So for many years, this raised an interesting question of, if I'm not really dominantly charitable and something has a meaningful economic component to it, is that okay? Or do I have to pick a lane? Meaning, if I'm investing for investment's sake, then I need to really focus on the return, like any other investment. Or I'm in the PRI camp, and the investment takes a back seat, as I've been saying, and I'm really just focused on the impact. What about something in the middle? It's very much impact driven, but it has a higher potential for economic return. So there was a question, an unanswered question for many years about whether that would be acceptable. And then the IRS issued a notice in 2015 addressing this concept of what they called a mission-related investment, as opposed to a program-related investment. And the concept of a mission-related investment is that the return potential there is greater, so you're not likely going to qualify as a PRI, But the IRS says it's okay to make mission-related investments, sacrificing some amount of potential economic return in exchange for mission-related impact. That would not be a breach of fiduciary duty for the charity to say, we're gonna focus on both. Sure, if we just wanted to earn more dollars for our organization, we might invest otherwise, but under the circumstances, we think it is holistically appropriate and advantageous for our organization to make certain types of investments that marry these two concepts together, the impact and the investment return, and that choosing to do so would carry out the fiduciary duties of the organization. Now, Callie said that right now Cambiar is focusing on nonprofits, and these concepts of PRIs and MRIs are more typically found when a nonprofit funder is actually providing support to for-profits. Anytime that you are providing philanthropic dollars to for-profits, you inherently, private foundation, public charity, any type of 501c3, you have to ask the private benefit question. Because inherent to Section 501c3 charitable status is that the organization cannot give rise to more than incidental private benefit. This is part of the operational test of how you identify that a charitable organization is operating in furtherance of charitable purposes in a way that will sustain its tax-exempt status and not have the IRS question whether it is benefiting private interests more than insubstantially. And in thinking about private benefit, the IRS says to look at two different aspects of it, a qualitative analysis and a quantitative analysis. The qualitative analysis on private benefit is the private benefit a necessary concomitant? That is not my word, that is a word in the IRS guidance, a necessary concomitant of achieving the charitable purpose. And what that means is that in order to achieve a charitable outcome, it is unavoidable that some private benefit is going to occur. Some private interests are inherently going to be advanced by this activity. So just to give a really simple example, let's say an organization provides scholarships. So there is obviously private benefit to the individual or individuals who receive the scholarships, but that is considered consistent with 501c3 purposes. That is not considered impermissible private benefit because that private benefit is just a necessary byproduct of the larger charitable impact that the organization achieves by providing scholarship support to allow individuals in need to access educational opportunities. So that private benefit is really just part and parcel of the larger charitable outcome. It is an unavoidable result rather than the specific aim of the activity. That's on the qualitative side. On the quantitative side, you look at the amount of private benefit relative to the public benefit. And just to put a finer point on it, the private benefit should always be insubstantial relative to the amount of public benefit. And so when you have a charitable funder seeking to provide any type of investment, philanthropic investment hybrid, social impact, mission-related investments, etc., those are things that you're looking at. I may, in fact, be using charitable dollars to provide support to private interests, but am I doing so in a way, are we doing so in a way where that private benefit is just a byproduct of achieving a larger charitable outcome? Whenever an organization is thinking about how to deploy its assets, you're always going to come up with the questions of fiduciary duty. These decisions ultimately live at the level of the board of directors or board of trustees of the organization. That is the ultimate fiduciary body of the charity. But by extension, it certainly trickles down to management and staff, really everyone who has a hand in deciding and implementing how charitable dollars are used. And the aspects of fiduciary duty include state law concepts in terms of making decisions in a manner that is in the best interests of the organization. compliance with an organization's charter and governing documents, also relationship with what has been disclosed to the IRS in terms of what are your organization's charitable purposes, accountability to funders. How do we hold ourselves out to our funders, to our donors, supporters, and are we using the money that those supporters have given us in a way that is consistent with what we have represented to them? And oversight by regulatory bodies at both the federal and state level. All of these different considerations are appropriate for discussion, and especially when you're trying to push the envelope and chart a new course and doing something new. All of these questions come into play for the organizational decision makers in deciding what it is they're doing and how they're doing it. And just finally, now we're just bumping up here at the end of the allotted hour. This last slide really focuses on things that apply regardless of whether an organization is providing support to a for-profit, to a charity, to some other form of nonprofit, and these are all points that are worth considering on the funder side, but also on the recipient side in terms of thinking about what is the right fit. And Callie spoke so in such detail about the way that Cambiar approaches these issues, just negotiating the deal terms. And even though it's within the philanthropic space, really this can come down to a negotiation like any other type of business deal. And just listed here on the slide are some of the factors that come into play, both from the funder and the recipient side. In the loan context, what's the interest going to be? At market, below market, interest free? What's the repayment schedule going to be? Let's say the philanthropic support is being provided in a way that the recipient uses it to produce intellectual property. Does the grantor retain any rights to use that intellectual property in one form or another? Spoke earlier about the different targets, revenue shares. Do we use that? I said here, carrot or a stick. Do those revenue shares kick in when targets are met and succeeded, or are they used as an incentive, sort of a negative incentive in case those targets aren't met? Are there branding and recognition rights that you as the funder want to think about in terms of ensuring that the output of the activities that you have made possible include acknowledgement of your organization's support? Sort of a separate topic for another discussion is the whole UBIT consideration, unrelated business income tax. The more that a nonprofit is taking some form of revenue share in the activities of a for-profit, you would want to go through an analysis of what is the treatment of that revenue coming back to the nonprofit organization. Is it potentially taxable or not? And then also ongoing engagement. Just like Callie spoke about building that long-term relationship with a grantee, what are the other non-economic ways in which a funder may want to build out that relationship? Is it a seat on the board of the recipient, some advisory council? What type of reporting back are you looking for? All of these are material deal terms to think about on either side of the table in terms of figuring out a way to deploy dollars and to achieve maximum impact. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining this conversation. I hope that you found it interesting. I know I certainly enjoyed hearing so much of the thinking that goes into Cambiar's activities. And I will again reiterate that the CLE code is GRANTS 2025, GRANTS 2025. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.